Welcome home, Harold.
Lorraine. That's our farm. Now earn it back.
Sign. Everything becomes yours.
This isn't our home anymore. We'll never sell our souls.
Nobody will find you.
Keep talking.
Everyone already heard you.
An elderly couple stepped off a private jet expecting champagne and skyline views. Instead, the wind carried the smell of wet hay and the outline of a house they had spent 40 years trying to forget. Harold Bennett's knees buckled first. Lorraine grabbed his arm, not from surprise, but from a memory neither of them had chosen to relive. Someone had brought them here on purpose. Someone had studied the exact shape of their grief and wrapped it like a gift. And somewhere behind that studied kindness waited a signature they had not yet agreed to give. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. 3 weeks earlier, none of it had a name yet. It was only a cream-colored envelope heavier than it should have been sitting on the kitchen table where Lorraine had left the morning mail. Harold and Lorraine Bennett had built a quiet life in the years since their daughter left for college. He had spent 4 decades framing houses and repairing porches for other families. His hands permanently roughened his back, permanently bent a few degrees more than it used to be. She had taught 3rd grade for 31 years, correcting spelling tests at the kitchen table long after the classroom lights went dark. Their house was small, paid off, and warm in the way that only comes from 30 years of the same wallpaper and the same creak on the second stair. It was not the house either of them had once imagined they would grow old in. That house, the one they had actually imagined, sat 2 states away, or what was left of it did. In 1983, when interest rates climbed higher than either of them thought possible, and 2 bad harvests in a row emptied what little cushion they had, the bank had taken the family farm Harold's father built. Harold had been 36 years old, watching a sheriff's deputy nail a notice to his own front door, and he had never spoken about that morning in any detail, since not even to Lorraine, not even in the dark. He had simply packed what fit in a truck, moved his young family 2 counties over, and started over with a hammer and a set of borrowed tools. Some griefs did not need to be discussed to be understood. Lorraine had learned that about her husband, the way she learned everything about him, slowly and without asking twice. So when she opened the envelope that morning and read the letterhead Legacy Horizons Concierge, a family heritage appreciation program, her first instinct was mild curiosity. Her second reading further was something closer to disbelief. The letter named them directly. It congratulated Harold and Lorraine Bennett on being selected as an honored family for a private tribute weekend celebrating families who had once built and lost land in service of their communities. It mentioned by name a farm outside Millbrook that had not appeared in anything but a 20-year-old newspaper clipping and a property deed buried in a county archive. "Harold," she said, setting her coffee down carefully, "you need to see this." He read it twice, standing at the counter in his socks, and she watched something cross his face that she hadn't seen in years, not since Naya had graduated, not since their 40th anniversary. It was hope plain and unguarded, and it worried her more than she wanted to admit. How would they even know the name of the place, he said quietly. Not a question, really. More like he was testing whether saying it out loud would make it feel less strange. "That's what I'm asking myself," Lorraine said. The phone rang before either of them could sit with the thought much longer. It was Claire, their daughter, calling from the hospital between meetings. Her voice clipped the way it always was on a Tuesday. Lorraine mentioned the letter almost in passing, expecting her daughter to laugh it off or ask a dozen careful questions the way she usually did about anything unfamiliar. "That's a little strange," Mom Claire said, and there was a pause, papers shuffling somewhere on her end. a page being called over an intercom. "Can you send me a picture of it? I want to look at it properly when I'm not walking into a budget meeting." "Of course," Honey Lorraine said, and meant to, and then didn't not that day, because the phone rang again 20 minutes later, and this time it was a different voice altogether. Smooth, warm, unhurried, the kind of voice that made you feel like the only person he had spoken to all week. "Mr. and Mrs. Bennett," the voice said. "My name is Preston Voss, and I have the honor of overseeing your weekend personally. I understand congratulations are in order, though I imagine it's a lot to take in all at once." Harold on the extension in the hallway found himself smiling before he even realized it. "There's nothing for you to arrange, nothing for you to worry over," Voss continued smoothly. "The jet will be ready Saturday morning. All you need to bring is yourselves." "We haven't said yes yet," Lorraine said, glancing at her husband. There was a small, pleasant laugh on the other end of the line, the kind that assumed the answer already. "Of course," Voss said. "Take all the time you need. I'll simply have the plane waiting." The package arrived on a Tuesday, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, the kind of presentation that felt deliberate, almost theatrical. Inside was an antique mantel clock, its brass casing worn soft with age and engraved along the base in small, careful script, "Bennett Family Farm Est. 1951. Lorraine turned it over in her hands for a long time before she set it down. "He didn't buy this," she said. "This is too specific. This looks like it came from somewhere real." Harold didn't answer right away. He was still holding the note that had come with it, a single card, in the same cream stock as the first letter. It read simply, "A small piece of what was always yours. We look forward to giving you the rest of the story this weekend. P.V. Preston Voss called that evening, and this time Harold picked up before the second ring. His voice filled the kitchen, the way it had filled the hallway the week before, warm and unhurried, like a man with nowhere else he needed to be. "I hope the clock found its way to you safely," Voss said. "It took some doing to track down. There was a woman in the County Historical Society who remembered your father, Harold. Said he built half the barns still standing on that stretch of road." "You talked to someone who knew my father," Harold repeated, and Lorraine watched something in his shoulders soften that she hadn't seen soften in years. "I like to do my homework," Voss said, and there was a small laugh in it, easy and self-deprecating. "We even found a photograph. There was a dog, I believe. A big shepherd mix. Cooper, was it?" Lorraine's stomach turned over just slightly at the sound of that name. Cooper had died before Nia, before Claire, before any of the life that came after the farm. She hadn't said that name out loud in a decade. She found herself standing very still in the kitchen doorway, one hand resting on the frame. "That's remarkable research," she said, when Harold glanced toward her, waiting for her to say something. "Most companies don't dig that deep for a client." "You're not a client," Mrs. Bennett Voss said smoothly. "You're the reason the program exists at all. People like you and Harold, people who built something real and lost it to circumstances outside your control, that's exactly who Legacy Horizons was created to honor." It was, Lorraine thought later, a very good answer. Almost too good, the way a well-rehearsed line always sounds a beat too smooth against ordinary conversation. But Harold was already nodding along, and she didn't have the heart to interrupt the first unguarded smile she'd seen cross his face in longer than she wanted to admit. Claire came by that Saturday, dropping off a casserole dish she'd borrowed months earlier, and she noticed the clock sitting on the mantel before she noticed anything else. "That's new," she said, setting the dish on the counter. "Where'd that come from?" "The concierge company," Lorraine said. "The one from the letter I meant to send you." Claire picked up the note card, reading it twice, her expression settling into the particular stillness she wore when something at the hospital didn't add up on a chart. "You still haven't sent me that letter, Mom." I know. It's been a week, Hone. I've had my hands full." Lorraine waved a hand toward the kitchen, though nothing in it looked particularly full of anything. Can I see it now? I've got 15 minutes before I need to head back. Lorraine found the envelope in the drawer by the phone and Claire read it standing at the counter, her thumb tracing the letterhead, the raised print of Legacy Horizons Concierge. She turned it over, looking for an address, a phone number beyond the one already printed, anything that might tell her more than the letter itself offered. This doesn't say who runs it. Just Preston Voss, founder. No LLC name, no license number, nothing. It's a tribute program, Claire. Not a mortgage application. Harold said, not unkindly, but firm in a way that closed the subject more than he probably meant to. They found the farm name because they actually care about the history. That's rarer than you'd think. Claire looked at her father for a long moment, and something passed behind her eyes. Worry dressed up as patience. Just be careful is all I'm saying. People who know exactly what you want to hear usually know it because they went looking. We'll be careful, Lorraine said, reaching over to squeeze her daughter's hand. I promise you that. Claire left with the casserole dish empty and the letter still sitting on the counter unphotographed, and she told herself she'd look the company up properly once the week's budget meetings were behind her. It was a small decision, the kind made 100 times a week, by people who trusted that tomorrow would look enough like today to make up for it. That night, after Claire's car had pulled out of the driveway, Lorraine sat alone at the kitchen table with the clock ticking softly behind her, its new brass hands catching the light from the window. She thought about the shepherd dog, about the sound of his name in a stranger's mouth, and about how strange it was that comfort and unease could arrive in the exact same sentence. She didn't mention the feeling to Harold. He was already upstairs, humming something under his breath she hadn't heard him hum in years. An old hymn from a church that had closed before Naya was even born. And she didn't want to be the one to take that from him, not yet, not over a feeling she couldn't quite name. 2 days later, a second envelope arrived, thicker than the first, and this one did not contain a gift. It was a contract 12 pages long, titled Program Participation and Travel Authorization Agreement, printed in a font small enough that Harold had to hold it at arm's length to read the heading. He set it on the table between them like it was something delicate. Insurance liability standard travel stuff. He said, flipping through pages. He wasn't really reading the way a man flips through a magazine in a waiting room. Every company makes you sign something these days. Lorraine picked it up after him, scanning the opening paragraphs. The kind of dense, looping legal language that seemed designed to be skimmed rather than understood. Her eyes caught briefly on a clause near the middle of page 7, something about temporary logistical authorization for the duration of program participation, before the phone rang in the other room, and Harold called out that it was Voss's office confirming the pickup time for Saturday. By the time she came back to the table, the moment had passed, and the papers sat there between them, waiting patient, in the way that only paperwork can be. There was a line for 2 signatures stapled to the final page, beneath a paragraph of dense legal language that neither Harold nor Lorraine read past the first sentence of, before deciding together at the kitchen table that it was simply the cost of accepting something good. Harold signed first, the way he signed most things, quickly, and without much ceremony, the same way he used to sign off on lumber deliveries decades ago, trusting that a man's word on paper meant roughly what a man's word out loud meant. Lorraine hesitated over her own line a moment longer, pen hovering, and for a second, Harold thought she might not sign at all. "You okay?" he asked. "I just wish Claire had looked at this first," she said. "She reads things for a living. Insurance forms, hospital contracts. She'd know what half of this means. It's a gift agreement, Lorraine, not a mortgage." Harold reached over and squeezed her hand, the same gesture she'd used on their daughter days earlier passed along now, without either of them noticing the shape of it. "We can call her tonight and tell her all about it. She'll be happy for us," Lorraine signed. It felt in the moment like a small act of trust, rather than a decision at all the kind of thing you did. Because the alternative, calling the whole thing off over paperwork neither of you fully understood, felt somehow more embarrassing than simply moving forward. Claire did stop by again 2 days before the flight, this time without a casserole dish. As an excuse, just a genuine visit squeezed between a night shift and a morning meeting. She found the signed contract sitting on the counter next to a folded stack of clothes Lorraine had already started packing, and she picked it up without asking, flipping through it the way she flipped through discharge paperwork, fast scanning for anything that didn't sit right. "You already signed this 2 nights ago," Harold said from the living room, not looking up from the television. "It's fine, Claire. Standard travel stuff. There's a clause on page 7 about temporary authorization for logistics coordination." Claire's brow furrowed, the particular furrow she got when a chart didn't match a patient's symptoms. "That's vague. What does that even mean, logistics coordination?" "It means they book the hotel and figure out the car service," Honey Lorraine said, coming in from the kitchen, drying her hands on a dish towel. "You worry too much. It's your job, I know, but not everything is a crisis." Claire set the papers down slowly, and for a moment, nobody spoke. She loved her parents in the specific, exhausted way of an only child who had spent years watching them do everything themselves, refusing help, even when help was freely offered, and she recognized standing there that whatever she said next would either land as care or land as condescension. And there was rarely a way to know in advance which one her mother would hear. "Can I get a copy of this just to have? I won't call a lawyer behind your backs or anything dramatic, I promise. I just feel better having it." Harold waved a hand from the couch. "Take a picture if you want. Whatever helps you sleep at night." Claire photographed each page carefully with her phone, the flash catching the kitchen light in a way that made the paper look almost translucent. And she saved the images to a folder she didn't bother naming, the kind of folder that exists in every phone as a quiet, low-grade insurance policy against a worry too small to justify out loud, but too persistent to ignore. She didn't read them closely that night, or the next. There was a nurse shortage on her floor, and a budget presentation due Thursday, and the photograph sat in her phone the way most precautions do, taken, and then forgotten, waiting for a reason to matter. The night before the flight, Lorraine lay awake beside Harold, listening to him breathe steady, and even the sleep of a man who had made peace with something he hadn't fully examined. She thought about the clause Claire had pointed out, the phrase logistics coordination, turning over slowly in her mind. And she almost woke him to talk about it before deciding against it, the way she'd decided against so many small worries over 49 years of marriage, because morning always seemed to make things smaller, and because Harold's face these last 2 weeks had looked lighter than it had in years, and she did not want to be the one who put the weight back. Downstairs, the antique clock kept its steady rhythm on the mantel, the sound that had once belonged to a farmhouse kitchen, now filling a much smaller living room, and Lorraine found herself listening to it, the way she used to listen to the old one years and years ago, back when the ticking meant something as simple as time passing in a house that was still theirs. She got up once quietly and stood in front of it in her robe, tracing the engraved letters with one finger. Bennett Family Farm Est, 1951. It was strange, she thought, how a stranger's kindness could feel so precisely tailored to a wound you had spent decades trying to keep private. Voss had never asked them a single question about the farm. Not really, not the way a person asks when they are trying to understand something. He had simply already known and known and known, arriving with answers before either of them had thought to voice the questions, and there was a version of that which felt like being seen, and a version of it that felt like being studied, and standing there at midnight, Lorraine could not entirely tell which one she was looking at. She thought, too, about Claire's face when she'd read that clause aloud, the particular stillness that settled over her daughter whenever something professional in her caught on a detail the rest of the room had already moved past. Claire had inherited that from somewhere, though Lorraine had never been sure whether it was from her own mother's carefulness or from Harold's stubborn refusal to sign anything without turning it over, twice a trait he seemed this once to have quietly set aside. She told herself it was only nerves, the ordinary kind, that came before any trip, and she went back to bed and did not wake Harold. And in the morning, the unease had shrunk, as she'd known it would, down to something small enough to pack away, alongside the folded clothes already sitting by the door. She didn't know yet, drifting finally toward sleep, that $400 had already left their joint checking account that evening, withdrawn under a line item that read, Program Logistics Fee Legacy Horizons LLC, a transaction neither of them would notice until much later. Buried between an electric bill and a pharmacy charge, one small thread among many that had already begun quietly to pull. The airfield was nothing like Harold had pictured when he imagined private flight, which in truth he had only ever imagined from magazine photographs and the occasional movie. There was no terminal building with gleaming glass, no crowds, no departure boards flickering with city names. Just a long stretch of cracked asphalt behind a chain-link fence, a single low building with tinted windows and a gate that opened only after a man in a dark suit checked something on a tablet and nodded them through without a word, quaint Lorraine murmured, and Harold laughed, though the sound came out thinner than he meant it to. Preston Voss was waiting for them just inside the building, and in person he was exactly as his voice had promised. Tall silver at the temples, dressed in a soft gray sweater that looked expensive without announcing it. He crossed the room with both hands extended, taking Harold's in a firm double grip, before turning the same warmth on Lorraine. The Bennetts, he said, as though their names alone were an accomplishment. I've been looking forward to this for weeks. Beside him stood an older man, thinner, quieter, dressed in a charcoal blazer that seemed a size too formal for the setting. Voss introduced him with a light gesture, the kind a man makes toward furniture he's proud of. This is Dale Whitcomb, my legacy consultant. Dale's been with the program since the beginning. Think of him as the man who makes sure every detail is handled properly. Dale offered a small nod. No handshake, his eyes moving over Harold and then Lorraine with an attention that felt less like a greeting and more like an assessment, the way an appraiser looks at a piece of furniture before naming a price. Lorraine felt the weight of that look settle somewhere behind her sternum and did her best to smile through it. Pleasure, Dale said, and nothing more. Two other men waited near the aircraft steps, and they did not fit the picture at all. Both were broad through the shoulders in a way that seemed cultivated rather than natural, dressed in plain, dark clothes, with no company logo, no name tags, nothing to suggest which part of hospitality they belonged to. One of them lifted the Bennetts' single shared suitcase without being asked, hoisting it onto the aircraft steps with an ease that made Lorraine think briefly, and without meaning to, of men who moved furniture for a living, or something heavier than furniture. Rick and Gus Voss said, following her gaze. They handle logistics for us. Don't mind them, they look rougher than they are. Harold laughed at that, an easy, trusting laugh, the kind he'd always had, and Lorraine found herself wishing not for the first time in 2 weeks that her husband's capacity for trust hadn't grown quite so wide with age. It had once been a careful, earned thing. Lately, it seemed to open at the first kind word offered to it. Inside the jet was smaller than Lorraine had expected, but finished with a kind of quiet expense that made the modest kitchen table conversations of the last 3 weeks feel very far away. Cream leather brass fittings, a low table already set with water glasses, etched with a small crest neither of them recognized. Voss gestured them toward the seats across from his own, settling in with the unhurried comfort of a man boarding his own private property rather than a shared charter. There is one small thing, Voss said once they were seated. once the door had begun its slow, mechanical close. Before we take off, Dale will just need your phones. Company policy, I'm afraid purely for insurance reasons during travel. You'll have them back the moment we land. Harold handed his over without pausing to think about it. Lorraine hesitated, her thumb resting for half a second longer than necessary against the case, thinking of the message she'd meant to send Claire that morning. And hadn't a simple wheels up love you the kind of message she always sent, before any trip, however small? Is that really necessary? She asked, keeping her voice light. Purely logistics, Dale said, and it was the first full sentence she'd heard from him, delivered without inflection, without apology. Cellular interference with certain onboard systems. We ask everyone. It was on its face a plausible enough answer, the kind of small inconvenience that came bundled with almost any kind of modern travel. And Lorraine told herself that as she placed the phone in Dale's open palm, watching him slide it into a locked drawer beneath the cabin's central console without a second glance. Still, something in her chest tightened as the drawer clicked shut, a small, cold awareness that she had just handed away the last thread connecting her to anyone who wasn't already inside this cabin. The engines rose to a low hum beneath them. Through the small oval window, Harold watched the airfield fall away, the chain-link fence and the cracked asphalt shrinking into something abstract, and beside him, Lorraine reached over and took his hand, gripping it. The way she hadn't gripped it in years, not out of affection exactly, but out of something closer to instinct. The same instinct that made a person reach for solid ground the moment the floor beneath them stopped feeling entirely trustworthy. Where exactly are we headed? Harold asked, glancing toward Voss, who was pouring himself a glass of water with unhurried hands. Voss smiled, and it was a warm smile, practiced and easy, and it did not answer the question at all. Somewhere I think you're going to find unbelievable, he said. Lorraine wanted to press further to ask for a city, a state, anything with a name attached to it. But Dale had already moved to the seat behind Voss, folding his hands in his lap with the stillness of a man settling in for a long wait. And Rick and Gus had taken their places near the rear of the cabin without a word. And there was something about the collective quiet of the four of them, so practiced, so synchronized, that made the question feel smaller in her mouth than it had a moment before. She let it go. Harold squeezed her hand once, reassuring, and turned his face toward the window, watching the last patchwork of familiar Ohio fields slide beneath the wing and disappear into cloud. For the first 20 minutes, the flight felt almost exactly like the fantasy Voss had sold them over the phone. A tray of small sandwiches appeared, cut into careful triangles. Voss talked easily about wine regions and old estates he'd visited, asked Lorraine about her years teaching third grade, asked Harold about the framing work he used to do, and seemed to listen to the answers the way very few people had listened to either of them in a long while. Harold felt himself relaxing into it, the tension of the airfield fading into something like enjoyment. And for a while, Lorraine let herself relax too, watching her husband laugh at something Voss said, thinking that perhaps she had let 3 weeks of quiet unease build into more than the moment deserved. Then Dale reached into a leather portfolio resting on his lap and produced a small stack of papers, sliding them across the low table with 2 fingers, the gesture so smooth it barely interrupted the conversation. Just a formality before we land, Dale said. Travel insurance addendum, standard for the remainder of the program. Harold reached for the pen, clipped to the folder without much hesitation, the way he'd signed the first contract at his own kitchen table. But Lorraine put a hand lightly over the papers before he could. Can we take a few minutes to read it properly first? Of course, Voss said, smiling, though something in his eyes shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of impatience quickly smoothed back over. Take all the time you need. We land in about 40 minutes, so whenever's convenient. It was polite. It was also Lorraine understood immediately, not really a yes. She began reading anyway, slowly, deliberately, her finger tracing each line the way she used to trace a student's handwriting to check for understanding. The language grew denser the further she read, circling around phrases like temporary asset stewardship and emergency management authorization phrases that meant nothing and everything at once phrases built. She was beginning to suspect precisely, so that a tired person skimming quickly would let their eyes slide right over them. "This says something about asset stewardship," she said aloud, glancing up. "What does that mean exactly in this context?" Boilerplate Dale said, without looking up from his own papers. "In case of a medical event during travel, someone needs limited authority to make arrangements on your behalf. It protects you, not us." It was a good answer. It was, Lorraine thought, the second very good answer she'd heard from these people in as many weeks, and something about how quickly and smoothly it arrived made her trust it less rather than more. She looked at Harold, hoping to find an ally, and found instead a man rubbing absently at his chest. His brow furrowed in a way that had nothing to do with the paperwork at all. "Harold, just a little tight," he said. "Probably the pressure. Happens sometimes on planes." But it wasn't just tightness. Not the way his hand pressed flat against his sternum. Not the faint gray tone that had crept into his face in the last several minutes. Lorraine had watched this man for 49 years. She knew the particular stillness he went into when something hurt more than he wanted to admit. "Your pills," she said, already reaching for the small bag at her feet. "Where's your bag?" Harold fumbled the small orange bottle from his jacket pocket with hands that weren't quite steady, and Lorraine pressed a tablet into his palm, watching him swallow it, dry, watching his shoulders slowly loosen as the seconds passed. Voss watched all of this with an expression that Lorraine would think about often in the days that followed. Not alarm, exactly. Not concern in the way a stranger's face usually held concern for someone else's medical distress, but something closer to patience. The particular patience of a man waiting for an inconvenience to resolve itself so a conversation could continue. "Perhaps we table the paperwork," Voss said smoothly once Harold's breathing had steadied, "until after we've landed and you've both had a chance to rest." It should have felt like relief. Instead, Lorraine found herself watching Dale quietly return the papers to the portfolio unsigned, and thought with a clarity that surprised her that this was not a kindness. It was only a delay. The plane began its descent, not long after the pressure shifting in Lorraine's ears, and she leaned toward the small oval window, watching the clouds thin and break apart beneath them, revealing a patchwork of green fields she did not recognize. At first, rolling hills, a narrow gravel road cutting between two stretches of fence line. And then, as the plane banked lower, she saw the roofline. Weathered wood, a chimney standing slightly crooked against the afternoon sky. A wraparound porch she had scrubbed on her hands and knees 1,000 times decades ago, in a life she had spent 40 years convincing herself was closed for good. She did not say anything. She could not. Her breath simply stopped, caught somewhere behind her ribs and beside her. Harold, following her gaze, went very still. "That's not possible," he said finally, his voice barely above the hum of the engines. "That can't be what I think it is." Voss leaned forward slightly, watching them both with an expression that for the first time since the airfield looked entirely unguarded, almost hungry. The look of a man watching the exact reaction he had spent weeks engineering finally arrive on schedule. He did not confirm anything. He didn't need to. The house below them growing larger and more solid by the second, as the plane continued its slow descent, answered the question more completely than any word could have. "Breathe," Harold, Lorraine said, though she wasn't entirely breathing herself. Her hand tightening around his, both of them staring down at a roofline neither had expected to see again outside of memory. 40 years of Sunday dinners and porch light and a hammer in Harold's father's hand, all of it rising up out of the green fields below like something conjured rather than found, and Lorraine understood, watching Dale's calm, unreadable face across the cabin, that whatever waited for them on that ground had been planned with a precision that had nothing to do with kindness at all. The wheels touched down with a soft, controlled bump, and the engines began their slow wind towards silence. And somewhere in that silence, Lorraine realized her hands folded together in her lap had not stopped trembling since the moment she first recognized the shape of that chimney against the sky. They walked down the aircraft steps into air that smelled exactly the way Harold remembered it: cut grass and distant rain and something mineral underneath that might have been the creek that ran along the property's east edge. Neither of them spoke as Voss led them across the gravel drive past a barn that had clearly been re-shingled within the last few years, toward a porch that had been repainted, the same faded blue Harold's mother had chosen back in 1962, a detail so precise it stole whatever words either of them might have managed to find. "We restored it a little over a year ago," Voss said, holding the front door open, with the easy pride of a man showing off something he'd built himself, though everything about the house, down to the iron door hinges, had clearly belonged to someone else first. "I like to think your father would be proud of the work." Inside, the floors had been refinished, but the bones were unmistakably original. The same crooked window in the kitchen that never quite closed. Right the same low doorway between the hall and the dining room that Harold used to duck under without thinking. Lorraine stood in the middle of the kitchen and found herself crying before she understood she'd started silent tears that came without any sound to announce them. And Harold put an arm around her, both of them standing very still in a room that had once held every ordinary morning of their early marriage. Dinner was served that evening in the dining room, a meal too elaborate for the setting, and Voss talked through most of it about restoration costs, about the historical society records he'd pulled to get the trim colors exactly right, and Harold, still moving through something between grief and wonder, found himself asking questions he hadn't planned to ask, softening toward this stranger in a way that made Lorraine's stomach tighten with every answer. She noticed things Harold, caught up in the flood of memory, did not seem to notice yet. The way Voss steered every warm story back toward some mention of how much simpler life could be, how much lighter if certain burdens were handled by people who understood them. The way Dale never once sat down to eat with them, choosing instead to stand near the doorway, watching the way a man watches a room he expects to need to control later. The way the good china on the table matched exactly a pattern Lorraine remembered from her own mother-in-law's cabinet, as though someone had gone looking for it, specifically tracked it down at an estate sale or an antique shop. One more precise detail in a house built entirely out of precise details. It was only after the plates had been cleared, after Rick had appeared silently to collect them and disappeared again without a word, that Voss's tone shifted. He folded his hands on the table, and the warmth in his face rearranged itself into something more deliberate. "I want to be honest with you both," he said. "This house isn't simply a gift, it's an opportunity." Lorraine felt Harold's hand find hers under the table. "Legacy Horizons helps families like yours simplify their estates," Voss continued. "In exchange for a lifetime residency agreement, here full ownership, full access, no rent, no mortgage ever, we would ask you to transfer management of your current assets. Your house in Ohio, your pensions, your savings accounts. All of it consolidated under our care, professionally managed, so that neither of you ever has to worry about a bill or a repair or a bank statement again." The silence that followed was total. Somewhere outside, a screen door banged softly in the wind. "You want us to sign away everything we have," Harold said slowly, "to live in a house you already own. I want you to stop carrying a burden you've carried for 40 years, Voss said, and his voice remained gentle, almost tender. The voice of a man offering comfort rather than making a demand. "You built something here once, and it was taken from you by forces you couldn't control. I'm giving you the chance to simply come home. All I'm asking is that you let people who are good at managing complexity handle the complexity so you can finally rest. No, Lorraine said before Harold could answer, her voice steadier than she felt. Absolutely not. Something flickered across Voss's face, brief and cold, gone as quickly as it appeared. I understand this is a lot to consider, he said, standing, smoothing the front of his sweater. Take the evening. Sleep in your old rooms. We'll talk again in the morning. We'd like to go home tonight, Harold said. Thank you for the dinner for the house, truly. But we'd like to go home. Voss smiled, and it did not reach his eyes at all. Of course, he said. You're welcome to stay here as long as you like. As for tonight's flight, I'm afraid the crew has already stood down for the evening. We'll revisit the schedule tomorrow once you've had time to think it over. He left the room without waiting for a response, and through the front window, Lorraine watched Rick cross the yards from toward the gate at the end of the drive, watched him swing it shut and loop a heavy chain through the latch. Unhurried, methodical. A task performed the way a man performs something he has done many times before. Harold came to stand beside her at the window, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. Outside, the last of the daylight was draining out of the sky behind the barn, turning the fields the deep blue-gray Harold remembered from 100 evenings, exactly like this one decades ago, before any of it had been taken from him. It should have felt like coming home. Instead, it felt like something closing. He's not going to let us just leave, is he? Harold said. It wasn't really a question. No, Lorraine said. I don't think he is. She thought of Claire, 2 hours and a world away, probably eating dinner alone in front of the television, unaware that her parents' phones sat locked in a drawer on an airplane parked somewhere behind the barn, unaware that the letter she'd asked to see, the one she still hadn't fully read, had led them here. Lorraine pressed her palm flat against the cool glass of the window her own mother-in-law used to wipe down every Sunday morning, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she let herself fully feel the shape of what she had walked into. By the second morning, the shape of their confinement had become clear in a way that no one bothered to disguise anymore. There was no car in the drive. No keys offered no explanation beyond Dale's calm insistence that the schedule was still being finalized. Rick or Gus seemed always to be somewhere within view of the house, tending to some small task that never quite required them to leave, and when Harold walked the length of the drive toward the gate, testing it. The chain held fast, and Gus appeared on the porch a moment later, not threatening exactly, just present the way a locked door is present. Lorraine spent the morning doing what she had always done when the walls of a situation felt too close. She cleaned. She swept the kitchen floor that didn't need sweeping, wiped down counters already spotless, and in the process found herself drawn, almost without deciding, to be toward the old barn at the edge of the yard, the one structure Voss's renovation crew had apparently not bothered to touch. Its doors hung slightly crooked, the wood silvered with age in a way the rest of the property no longer was, and something about its untouched shabbiness felt for the first time in 2 days like an honest thing in a place that had otherwise been arranged too perfectly. Inside, dust hung visible in the slats of light coming through the roof boards, and old farm equipment sat rusting in the corners, untouched, forgotten. Along one wall, beneath a workbench that might have been Harold's father's, Lorraine found a metal filing box unlocked its hinges, stiff with disuse. Inside were papers yellowed at the edges, but not old enough to belong to the Bennett's era, dated within the last several years. A ledger, handwritten, listing names, dates, dollar figures. And beneath the ledger, a small stack of letters, thank you notes on the same cream stationery Voss favored, addressed to a Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield, expressing gratitude for their participation in the program. Lorraine sat down slowly on an overturned crate and read through what she could before her hands began to shake too badly to continue. The Whitfields, it seemed, had been an elderly couple from Kentucky, recipients of a similar invitation 18 months earlier, guests of honor at a different restored property 2 counties over. The ledger tracked disbursements, a pension redirected here, a savings account liquidated there over the course of nearly a year, and then abruptly the entries stopped. No forwarding address, no further correspondence. Just a final line in Dale's careful, cramped handwriting: matter resolved. File closed. She did not know what resolved meant, not exactly, and she found she did not want to imagine it too closely. She wrapped the ledger and the letters in an old feed sack and carried them back toward the house, pressed against her chest, like something that might shatter, and she was halfway across the yard when she heard Harold's voice from the porch, tight and strange, calling her name in a way he hadn't in years. She found him gripping the porch rail, his face the color of ash, one hand pressed flat against his sternum, his breathing shallow and fast in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. Dale was already there, watching from the doorway with an expression Lorraine hadn't seen on him before, something that might in another man have been called concern. "His pills," Lorraine said, dropping the feed sack by the door, already moving toward Harold. "Where's his bag? Where's the bottle?" "He took one 20 minutes ago," Dale said. "It isn't helping." "Then we need a hospital. Now. Real doctors, not whatever you people have arranged for out here." Dale's jaw tightened, some internal calculation working behind his eyes, and for a moment Lorraine thought she saw the exact instant a man's conscience and his employer's instructions began quietly to diverge. "I'll speak to Preston," he said finally, and turned back into the house, leaving Lorraine alone on the porch with her husband's ragged breathing and a feed sack of some other family's stolen life pressed against the doorframe where she'd left it. "Stay with me," she whispered, lowering herself beside Harold, taking his hand in both of hers. "Stay right here with me, Harold Bennett. You are not leaving me in this yard." His fingers tightened weakly around hers, and somewhere behind them, through the screen door, she could hear the low murmur of Dale's voice on a phone she hadn't known was still working, arguing quietly with someone about a decision that had apparently not yet been made. Minutes passed, the way minutes only pass in moments like that, one each second stretched thin and heavy. Harold's breath slowly evening out under her hands, even as his color remained wrong gray at the edges of his mouth. Lorraine kept talking to him, low and steady, telling him about the porch swing his father had built, about the summer Nia had learned to ride a bicycle in this exact yard. Memories she wasn't even certain were true anymore, so much as things she needed to say out loud to keep her own hands from shaking. Dale came back out. Eventually, his phone gone from his hand, his face arranged into something careful and unreadable. "There's a doctor Preston trusts 40 minutes out. Private. Discreet." He crouched, checking Harold's pulse at the wrist with 2 fingers, an old practiced gesture that surprised Lorraine coming from him. "He'll live if we get him settled and keep him calm. No hospital." Preston was very clear on that point. "Preston isn't a doctor," Lorraine said. "No," Dale agreed quietly, something almost like an apology passing behind his eyes before it vanished again. "He isn't." He helped her get Harold inside onto the old sofa in the front room, propped upright with pillows that still smelled faintly of cedar and dust. And it was only once Harold's breathing had steadied further, once his hand had gone slack and warm again in hers, that Lorraine remembered the feed sack still sitting by the door, and the ledger inside it, and the name Whitfield sitting heavy in her chest, like a second colder kind of fear. She waited until Dale had gone to find the private doctor before she carried the sack upstairs and hid it beneath a loose floorboard in the room that had once been Harold's, as a boy pressing the board back into place. with the flat of her palm memorizing its exact location the way she used to memorize the placement of every item on a classroom shelf. Whatever came next, she thought she would not let this particular truth disappear the way the Whitfields apparently had. Claire told herself for the first 2 days that the silence meant nothing. Her parents had never been reliable texters, and a networking weekend or whatever this concierge trip actually was would naturally keep them busy from morning until night. She had sent one message Saturday afternoon, "Hope you two are having fun," and had gotten back hours later a reply so short it barely registered as strange at the time. All good. Talking later. It was the third day sitting in her car in the hospital parking garage after a double shift that the wrongness of it finally settled into something she couldn't talk herself out of. She read the message again. All good. Talking later. No emoji, and her mother always used emojis, small yellow hearts, scattered through even the most mundane texts about grocery lists. No mention of Harold. No mention of where they were, what they'd seen, anything at all resembling the excited paragraphs Lorraine typically sent from anywhere further than the next county over. It read like something written by someone who knew what her mother's texts were supposed to sound like without actually being her mother, Claire called. It rang twice and went to voicemail, an automated message, the mailbox belonging to Lorraine Bennett, but the tone of the greeting somehow off. Or maybe that was only her imagination working overtime after 11 hours on her feet. She called Harold's phone next. Same result. She sat in the dark garage for a long time after that, scrolling back through her photos looking for anything her parents had sent before the trip. There wasn't much. A blurry shot of the antique clock. And then further back, a selfie Lorraine had sent from what must have been the airfield, the two of them squinting into afternoon sun, a sleek, dark aircraft filling most of the frame behind them. Claire had barely glanced at it when it first arrived, sent back a quick heart, and moved on with her day. Now she opened it full screen and studied it properly for the first time the way she studied a chart that didn't add up. Her mother's smile looked tight. Not unhappy exactly, but held the smile of someone performing ease for a photo rather than feeling it. And on the tail of the aircraft, small but unmistakable once she zoomed in, sat an emblem she didn't recognize at all. An angular gold crest with looping script beneath it that didn't resemble the logo of any charter company she'd ever seen advertised. She thought of the folder on her phone, the photographs of the contract she'd taken weeks earlier and never actually read. She opened it now, sitting alone in the garage with the engine off and the cold beginning to seep into the car, and read every page slowly, the way she should have read them the first time. The clause on page 7 jumped out at her immediately, this time no longer buried among boilerplate, but sitting there plainly once she knew to look for it, temporary logistical authorization, extending under specific triggering conditions to broader financial stewardship. It wasn't insurance language. It was a door left deliberately ajar. She called the local sheriff's non-emergency line that night, and again the following morning, and was told gently but firmly that 2 adults traveling voluntarily on a signed agreement did not meet the threshold for a missing persons investigation, not yet, not without more than a bad feeling and an unfamiliar logo. "They're grown adults, ma'am," the deputy on the phone told her. "People go quiet on vacation all the time." Claire hung up and sat at her kitchen table with the photograph enlarged on her laptop screen, the gold crest glowing faintly in the dim light of her apartment, and felt something harden in her chest that had nothing to do with panic anymore, and everything to do with the particular focused anger of a person who has just realized that no one else is going to solve this for her. She began searching the emblem, the only way she knew how, cropping the image, running it through every search tool she could find. Cross-referencing aviation registries late into the night, and by 2 a.m, she had a name that meant nothing to her yet, and would mean everything by the end of the week, Legacy Horizons concierge registered under a holding entity she couldn't fully trace, tied to a man named Preston Voss. There was almost nothing public about him. A handful of glowing testimonials on a sleek but strangely thin website. No address beyond a suite number and a business park 2 states away. No reviews on any site she trusted. No record of the company beyond its own carefully curated presence. It was the kind of absence that would have meant nothing to her 2 weeks earlier, and now felt after everything else like its own kind of red flag, the digital equivalent of a house with too many doors and none of them marked. She printed the contract pages, the photograph, and everything she'd found about Legacy Horizons, and drove straight to the sheriff's station the next morning before her shift, sliding the folder across the counter to the same deputy who had brushed her off on the phone. His name she saw now on his badge was Boyd Kearns, and he looked at the papers with the mild, tired patience of a man who had seen 100 worried adult children over the years, most of whom turned out to be worried over nothing. "On paper, ma'am, your folks signed this themselves," he said, tapping the last page of the contract. "Freely, from what I can see. I understand you're scared, but I can't open a case on a legal contract, and a logo I can't place." Claire left the station with the folder still in her hands, and her jaw tight enough to ache, and it was in the parking lot sitting behind the wheel with the engine not yet started that she finally admitted to herself that the system built to help her wasn't going to move fast enough, and that if anyone was going to find her parents before whatever was happening to them became something that couldn't be undone, it was going to have to be her. Claire called in sick for the first time in 3 years and spent the entire day at her kitchen table, laptop, open phone, charging beside her, systematically working through every avenue she could think of. She tried the aviation registry office, directly was transferred twice, and got nowhere. She tried a reporter who'd once covered a nursing home scandal in the next county, who was sympathetic, but explained gently that without more concrete evidence, there wasn't a story yet, only a worry. It was somewhere around her 4th cup of coffee that she typed "elder financial exploitation attorney" into a search bar out of pure desperation, more a plea than a search term, and found 3 results down a small firm, 2 counties over specializing in elder law, with a name attached that would come to matter more than Claire could have imagined that afternoon. Priya Anand. Priya answered her own phone, which surprised Claire enough that she nearly lost her train of thought explaining why she was calling. But Priya listened without interrupting, asked precise, careful questions. When did they leave? What exactly did the contract say? Do you have copies? And by the time Claire finished talking, there was a different quality to the silence on the other end of the line. Not doubt, but recognition. "Can you email me those contract photos right now?" Priya said. "And the picture of the plane, if you have it. I want to look at something." Claire sat gripping her phone while she heard faintly the sound of typing on the other end, a pause, more typing. When Priya came back, her voice had changed again, sharper, now focused in the particular way of someone who has just found the shape of something they've been circling for a while, without knowing it. "I need to be honest with you," Priya said. "I've seen this pattern before. Not this exact company, but this exact shape of a scheme. Somebody researches an older couple, usually someone with a pension or a paid-off property, finds an old wound, something they lost, and offers to give it back to them in exchange for signing away control of what they have now. The contract language is the tell. Temporary logistical authorization is not a real legal term. It's a placeholder they use to make an illegal power of attorney look routine." Claire felt something cold settle low in her stomach. "You're saying they've done this to other people?" "I'd put money on it," Priya said. "Companies like this rarely start with their first victims. They refine the process." She was quiet for a moment. "I did a record search while we were talking. Legacy Horizons concierge isn't owned directly by anyone named Preston Voss. It's owned by a holding company called Millbrook Heritage Partners, which is in turn owned by two other LLCs registered in Delaware. That kind of structure isn't for tax efficiency. It's built specifically so that if something goes wrong, there's no single name for a lawsuit or a subpoena to land on. So what do we do? Claire's voice cracked slightly on the question, 3 days of held-together composure finally beginning to fray. We move fast, and we move through the front door. Not the back one, Priya said. I can file an emergency petition today, an emergency guardianship and asset freeze request, based on what you've already given me. It won't be instant. Judges don't sign things at the snap of a finger. But it puts a legal claim on record that your parents may be under undue influence or duress, which changes what law enforcement is required to do with it. Is that enough? Fast enough? There was a pause on the line longer this time, and when Priya spoke again, her voice had softened just slightly, the tone of someone choosing to be honest rather than comforting. I pulled the flight plan filed for the aircraft registered under that same emblem. There's a return flight logged for 2 days from now. If there's a document your parents haven't signed yet, whatever it is, someone is working against a deadline to get it signed before then. So no, Claire, we don't have a lot of room to be slow about this. Claire closed her eyes, picturing her mother's tight smile in the photograph. Her father's stubborn trust in anyone who spoke to him kindly, and when she opened them again, her hands had stopped shaking for the first time in 3 days. Tell me exactly what you need from me, she said, and tell me where to bring it. Priya's office was smaller than Claire expected, a converted house on a quiet residential street, but the woman herself filled the room the moment Claire walked in, an hour later, already 3 folders deep into a search that had in that short time grown considerably. Priya had traced the aircraft's registered flight path to a rural airstrip in West Virginia, cross-referenced against a property record search that turned up a residential restoration permit, filed 18 months earlier under yet another shell entity, Heritage Restoration Group, for a parcel of land that, according to the county's own historical survey, had once been known locally as the Old Bennett Place. Your father's farm, Priya said quietly, turning her laptop so Claire could see the listing. They didn't just study your parents' history. They bought it back and rebuilt it specifically to bring them there. Claire stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling something between horror and a strange, aching recognition, the shape of her father's oldest grief, laid out in a permit filing like it was nothing more than a renovation project. That's where they are, she said. That has to be where they are. Priya was already reaching for her phone to call the courthouse clerk's office before the county offices closed for the day, already talking through half to Claire and half to herself what an emergency petition filed that afternoon might set in motion by morning. I'll have the paperwork ready to file within the hour, she said. You should call Deputy Kearns back. Tell him exactly what you just told me. A specific address changes everything. Harold's color had returned by the next morning, though the private doctor Dale had brought in a quiet, uneasy man who examined Harold quickly and left even more quickly, had warned that another episode of real stress could be far more dangerous than the first. Voss took this news with the same smooth calm. He took everything, expressing concern in all the right words, while making no move whatsoever to change the arrangement, keeping them there. All the more reason to settle this quickly, he said, standing in the doorway of the front room where Harold still rested on the sofa. The sooner we finalize things, the sooner everyone can relax. I'd hate for either of you to be under this kind of strain a moment longer than necessary. It was Lorraine, understood by now, not concern at all. It was a deadline dressed up as kindness, the same trick he'd been playing since the first envelope arrived at their kitchen table 3 weeks earlier. That evening, Voss returned with the papers again, laying them on the low table in front of Harold with a fountain pen resting neatly across the top page. Tomorrow, he said, I think it's time we finished this, don't you? You could be settled here, truly settled by dinner. And if we still say no, Harold asked, his voice thin but steady, Voss's smile didn't waver, but something underneath it did a flicker of the same coldness Lorraine had glimpsed the first night at dinner. "Then I suppose we'll simply have to keep enjoying each other's company a while longer," he said. "You don't have anywhere else to be, do you?" "Not really. Not anymore." It was the closest he had come to saying it outright, and Harold heard it exactly the way it was meant, a quiet, terrible reminder that as far as anyone outside this property knew, they had chosen to be here. That night, once the house had gone dark and quiet, Harold lay awake beside Lorraine, turning something over slowly in his mind. In the bottom of the small canvas bag he'd carried everywhere for the last 15 years of side jobs and carpentry work sat an old handheld voice recorder. A relic he still used to leave himself notes about measurements and cut lists. One small habit from a working life that had never quite left him. He hadn't touched it since they'd arrived. He wasn't certain lying there that it even had battery left. It did. A single bar blinking faintly when he pressed the button under the blanket, testing it. His heart beating harder than the small effort should have warranted. In the morning, when Voss came again with the papers and the same patient, immovable smile, Harold slipped the recorder into his shirt pocket, thumb resting against the button, and said nothing about it at all. "I understand you need a home," Voss said, settling into the chair across from him. Voice low and warm, performing gentleness, the way he always did, just before he asked for something. "But you don't have another one to go to, Harold." "Not really. I've made certain of that." Harold's thumb pressed the button. "What does that mean?" He said carefully, "Made certain of that. It means the logistics fee your wife signed off on 3 weeks ago wasn't only a logistics fee," Voss said almost gently, almost as if he were doing Harold a kindness by finally being honest. "It means your accounts back in Ohio have already been restructured under our management pending finalization. It means the house you think is still waiting for you has a lien on it now that didn't exist a month ago. Sign here and none of that matters. Don't, and you'll find out exactly how much of your old life is still yours to go back to." The room went very quiet. Harold felt the recorder's small plastic edge against his chest, like something solid to hold on to. And for the first time in days, he did not feel only afraid. He felt something colder and steadier settle into place beside the fear. Upstairs, at almost the same moment, Lorraine knelt beside a loose board in the floor of an old bedroom, working free. Not the ledger this time, but a second object she'd found tucked beside it 2 days earlier, and said nothing about an ancient flip phone dead forgotten, likely belonging to whichever farmhand had last used this room decades before any of them had returned. She had spent an hour the previous night wiring it to a small solar charger meant for garden lights salvaged from the barn, coaxing just enough life into it to send one message typed with trembling fingers to the number Dale had pressed into her palm without explanation 4 days earlier. She did not know if it was a trap or a lifeline. She sent it anyway. "Millbrook Farmhouse. Send help. Hurry." The message sat on the tiny cracked screen for a long moment, a small spinning icon that made her chest ache with every second. It refused to resolve into anything sent or failed, and she nearly gave up entirely, nearly slid the phone back beneath the floorboard, convinced the signal was too weak, the battery too far gone. Then the icon blinked once and disappeared, replaced by a single word she would remember for the rest of her life. Sent. She sat back against the wall beneath the window, the dead phone cooling in her lap, and allowed herself for just a moment the smallest possible flicker of hope, quickly followed by a colder, more practical thought. She had no way of knowing who was on the other end of that number, whether it belonged to someone who could help them, or simply to another arm of whatever Dale answered to. She thought of the careful way he'd pressed the paper into her hand in the barn days earlier, the flicker of something human behind his flat expression when Harold's chest had seized on the porch. She chose in the end to trust it, not because she was certain, but because there was nothing left to do but choose. Downstairs, she could hear Voss's voice through the floorboards, still low, still patient, still circling her husband, like water finding the last remaining crack in a wall, and she pressed her palm flat against the old wood beneath her, the same board that had once decades ago held nothing heavier than a little girl's paper dolls, and waited. The message reached Priya Anand at 11 minutes past 10 that night, forwarded within seconds to Claire's phone. And by 6 the next morning, the three of them, Claire, Priya, and Deputy Boyd Kearns, who had called back himself once Priya's emergency petition landed on a judge's desk with a specific address attached to it, were in 2 cars heading for a gravel road in West Virginia that none of them had ever driven before. Inside the farmhouse, Voss had lost patience with gentleness sometime overnight. He sat across from Harold in the front room, with the papers spread wide, the fountain pen no longer resting politely to the side, but pressed directly into Harold's hand. Dale standing near the window, Rick and Gus positioned at the room's 2 exits like furniture that had learned to breathe. "This is the last morning I intend to ask nicely," Voss said. "Sign the transfer and this house, this life is yours again, free and clear, no more strain on that heart of yours. Don't, and I promise you, Harold, there won't be a version of your life left standing to go back to." Harold looked at the pen in his hand, at Lorraine standing rigid by the window, at the recorder still resting warm against his chest, where it had sat quietly running since the morning before. He set the pen down on the table deliberately, the small sound of it against the wood filling the whole room. "I lost this house once," he said, his voice low but entirely steady. "I was 36 years old, and I watched a man nail a paper to my own front door, and I never got to choose how that happened. I get to choose this time." He looked up, meeting Voss's eyes directly for the first time in days. "I am not signing away the rest of my life to buy back something I already grieved. You don't get to charge me twice for the same loss." Voss's expression hardened into something Lorraine had not seen from him, yet the last thin layer of charm finally gone. "That's a mistake," he said quietly, and turned toward Gus with something unspoken passing between them, a signal Lorraine understood immediately as the beginning of something worse. It was at that exact moment that the sound of tires on gravel reached the house, 2 vehicles moving fast up the long drive and through the front window. Dale was the first to see the county sheriff's markings on the lead car, the second car following close behind, with Claire already halfway out the passenger door before it had fully stopped. Something shifted in Dale's face, the same flicker Lorraine had seen in the barn days earlier, and this time he did not hesitate. He stepped away from the window, away from Voss, and unlatched the front door himself, standing back to let it swing open rather than blocking it. Deputy Kearns came through first, one hand resting on his belt, voice carrying the flat authority of a man executing a court order rather than responding to a hunch. "Preston Voss, I have an emergency order here regarding the residency and financial status of Harold and Lorraine Bennett. I need everyone in this room to stay exactly where they are." Claire was already across the room, arms around her mother, both of them holding on hard enough to hurt, and behind them, Priya moved to Harold's side, glancing once at the untouched pen on the table, at the unsigned papers beside it, and something in her face eased with visible relief. "He's been recording," Harold said, his voice shaking now that the moment had finally cracked open, reaching into his shirt pocket with fingers that trembled but did not fumble. "Voss. Everything he said this morning about the accounts, about the land. It's all on here." Priya took the small recorder from him, with the careful reverence of someone accepting evidence that mattered more than she could yet fully explain, and Deputy Kearns's attention swung sharply toward Voss, whose composure for the first time since any of this had begun had nowhere left to go. "There's more," Lorraine said, moving toward the stairs before anyone could stop her. There's a ledger. Upstairs. Other families. A couple named Whitfield. You need to see it before he has a chance to make it disappear. Rick took one step toward the stairwell, some old instinct toward interference still firing, and Kearns was faster, closing the distance in 3 strides, his voice sharp, now final. Don't. Hands where I can see them. All of you. Voss stood very still in the middle of his own restored kitchen, in the house he had rebuilt board by board to bait a wound 40 years old, and said nothing at all. And it was, Lorraine thought later, the first time in 3 weeks that his silence had told her more truth than anything he had ever said out loud. Kearns radioed for backup and a second unit, while Priya knelt beside the untouched contract, photographing every page where it lay. Careful not to disturb the pen still resting exactly where Harold had set it down. Upstairs, Claire followed her mother to the loose floorboard, and together they pried it free, lifting out the feed sack with its ledger and its careful, damning list of names. Priya paged through it, standing right there in the old bedroom, her expression darkening with each entry, murmuring dates and figures under her breath, like a woman confirming something she had already suspected, but hoped for the family's sake she might have been wrong about. 4 other names, she said finally. At least 4 other families before the Bennetts. We can use this. This is exactly what turns an emergency order into criminal charges. Downstairs, Dale had not moved from where he'd stood since opening the door, hands loosely at his sides, watching Kearns's deputy secure Rick's wrists behind his back, while Gus, seeing the direction things had gone, made no move to resist at all. When Kearns turned to him, Dale spoke before he was even asked a question. I have names, he said quietly. Dates, account numbers, more than what's in that ledger upstairs. I'll give you everything I have. He glanced once toward Harold, still sitting on the sofa with Lorraine's hand now gripping his, and something passed over his face that might have been shame, or might only have been the particular exhaustion of a man setting down a weight he had carried further than he meant to. I should have said something the day he got sick on that porch. I didn't. I'm saying it now. Voss said nothing to that either, only turned his face toward the window, toward the gravel drive and the gate Rick had chained shut, days earlier now standing open and beyond it. The long green fields rolling away from the house he had spent so much money and so much calculation trying to turn into a trap. Outside, a second sheriff's vehicle pulled into the yard, and Claire came back down the stairs, carrying the feed sack against her chest, the way her mother had carried it days before, and for the first time since she'd read that strange, clipped text message 3 days earlier, she let herself believe that this particular morning was going to end the way she had prayed it would. Winter had settled fully over Ohio by the time the civil hearing concluded, 4 months after a chained gate in West Virginia had swung open for the last time. The judge's ruling ran to 11 pages, but the part Claire read aloud to her parents at the kitchen table twice came down to a single sentence. The power of attorney signed under duress at the Millbrook property was void in its entirety, and full financial control was restored to Harold and Lorraine Bennett, effective immediately. Preston Voss faced trial on charges of elder financial exploitation and unlawful confinement, the ledger from the barn and Dale's cooperation together, painting a picture prosecutors described as methodical rather than impulsive, a business built on other people's grief. He would not see the outside of a courtroom as a free man again for a long while. Rick pleaded guilty in exchange for testimony against the others. Gus's case moved more slowly through the system, but moved nonetheless. Dale accepted probation and a lifetime ban from any form of financial consulting. And some weeks after the hearing, a short letter arrived at the Bennett's house, in his careful, cramped handwriting, an apology that named nothing specific and asked for nothing in return. Lorraine read it once, folded it, and set it in a drawer. She did not answer it. She did not throw it away either. Claire took a leave from the hospital for the 2 weeks surrounding the hearing, and somewhere in the long drives back and forth between Ohio and the courthouse, she and her parents fell into a different rhythm than the one they'd had before, less careful, less scheduled around brief visits and borrowed casserole dishes. Harold started calling her just to talk, not because anything was wrong, and Lorraine began sending the photographs Claire had once wished she'd shared sooner, small, ordinary pictures of the garden, of a new bird feeder, of nothing urgent at all. It was a small change, and it was in its own quiet way the truest repair any of them could have asked for. The Millbrook farmhouse itself became part of a restitution fund, once the frozen accounts of Legacy Horizons concierge were untangled by the courts. Placed in trust for the identified victims, the Whitfields among them, found at last in a supervised facility, 2 states over, quietly grateful to finally be believed. Harold and Lorraine did not ask for ownership. Priya had gently explained early on that the fairest outcome would spread whatever value remained across every family Voss had harmed. And Harold, when he heard that, had simply nodded. The decision costing him less than anyone watching might have expected. What he asked for instead and received was something smaller and stranger, a standing invitation written into the settlement itself for the Bennett family to visit the property whenever they liked, for as long as they liked guests rather than owners, welcome rather than trapped. They drove out on a clear afternoon in late October. The 3 of them, Claire behind the wheel this time, Harold and Lorraine in the back seat, like passengers on their own homecoming. The gate stood open. No chain, no lock, no one waiting on the porch with a folder of papers and a voice too smooth to trust. Just the house weathered now in a way that felt honest, the fresh paint from Voss's renovation already beginning to soften under a season of real weather instead of staged perfection. Harold walked the porch slowly, one hand trailing along the rail his own father had built, and stopped at the corner post nearest the steps, crouching with some effort until his fingers found what he was looking for, faint grooves cut into the wood initials carved there by a boy of 19 who had believed back then that this house would simply always be his. He pressed his palm flat against the letters for a long moment. "We could stay a while," Lorraine offered quietly, coming to stand beside him. "The invitation's ours whenever we want it." Harold looked out over the fields, gold and rust colored in the low autumn light, and then back at his wife and his daughter standing together on ground that had cost their family more than any of them would ever fully put into words. "I think I'd rather go home," he said. "Our home. The one nobody had to give back to us." Lorraine slipped her hand into his, and Claire watched her parents walk back down the porch steps together, unhurried, choosing to leave rather than being made to. And there was a particular kind of peace in that ordinary act that no amount of restored money or returned property could have manufactured on its own. They drove away as the sun dropped lower over the fields, the old farmhouse shrinking in the rearview mirror the way it had once shrunk from a moving truck window 40 years earlier. Except this time nothing was being taken from them. This time they were simply the ones who got to decide when to leave. Back home that night, Lorraine set the antique clock, the one that had started all of it, back on the mantel where it had sat for weeks, and found she no longer wanted to throw it out, the way she'd imagined doing more than once during the trial. It was still, after everything, a piece of something true, a record of a father who had built barns along a road 2 states away, even if the man who'd sent it had meant it as a leash rather than a gift. She wound it carefully, listened to it begin ticking again in the quiet living room, and decided that some things could be reclaimed piece by piece without needing to erase where they had come from. If you were moved by Harold and Lorraine's story, tell us in the comments what you think finally gave them back their peace, and stay with us for the next story soon.